In my many years of gaming, there have been two specific genres that have been major blind spots to me: multiplayer shooters and action games. I've always had hand tremors and tense wrists, which makes it a little difficult for me to access the level of twitchy reaction speed you need to really excel in that realm. It's not that I ever found these games to be boring, I just generally tend to suck at them, and usually I avoid doing things I suck at for fun. Suffice it to say that character action games, one of the fastest and most skill-intensive branches of the entire gaming industry, have never exactly been my forte. That is, until I picked up a copy of DmC 5 on a whim about a year and a half ago. Upon playing the game, I quickly became obsessed for about 2 months, and swore that I would play the entire series in hopes of developing some level of facility with the games. That promise was shuffled onto the back burner about as quickly as it was conceived, and disappeared into the recesses of my mind, until about a year ago. I was working on a revised and remastered version of my original Persona video when I realized that after moving to a new apartment and recording about 2/3 of my audio there, the file was completely scuffed. I pretty much lost all motivation to continue pursuing that project for the moment, and decided to shelve it for the time being. In my frustration, I realized that I had no idea what I was planning for my next video, when suddenly Devil May Cry just popped back into my mind. If ever there was a time to play through the entire DmC series and finally make my video on it, this was it. So how exactly is it that I, action game weakling extraordinaire, fell in love with DmC to begin with? Put simply, I had misjudged the games. I had always assumed that I would basically get nothing out of the game if I couldn't play it at the absolute highest possible level. I couldn't have been more wrong. Skill is absolutely a factor in DmC, but anyone can pick up the games and have a decent time. The basic setup of the combat is very, very simple. You can essentially mash triangle to win if that's how you want to approach the game. Beyond that, though, there's an incredible amount of depth and complexity to the combat systems. You can spend hour upon hour to gain intermediate facility with just one character in one DmC game. There are certain skills that translate across titles, but even then, each one has its own quirks and timing differentials that will make it a unique experience. Everyone will be speaking the same basic language of combat, but players reach vastly different peaks of fluency. Fluency really is the right word to describe any level of skilled DmC play. It's never so much that the actual process of learning a given move is difficult. That process takes just a couple of minutes. Each one will have a slightly different input and timings, but once you figure them out, it's pretty simple to replicate them. If each skill is a word, then the combos in DmC are the sentences. To reach those coveted triple S-tier combos, you have to be able to move and track enemies in 3 dimensions, know exactly what each input does at a split second's notice, and be able to follow up with something that will make logical sense and keep the combo going, based on where you are in relation to the enemies in the arena. When you're really playing DmC well, you're thinking roughly 2 to 3 moves in advance, managing as many as 10 different timing-sensitive variables that are unique to a given character, and leaving room for improvisation should the need arise. In this way, gameplay is narrative to DmC far more than any other game I've covered on this channel, except maybe Mirror's Edge. Sure, the games have more traditional narratives, and some of them are actually half-decent, but the emotion of DmC is in its combat. You'll feel the rush, the frantic pace of the slaughter, and your own cocky, confident badassery, because your inputs have to be just as frantic, fast, and confidently competent in order to keep that flow going. Sure, you might not have the lightning reflexes necessary to pull off lore-accurate combos like the best of them, but it's completely possible for even a slightly below-average player like myself to reach a level of competency where you routinely get S+ tier combos, even without that degree of systemic mastery. What matters is not getting hit, fluency, memorization of the individual moves. From that point on, there are no rules. It wasn't always like that, though. DmC is a series with a storied history, spanning 23 years. It's not just a character action series, it's the character action series. The systems of combat I've just described didn't just pop into existence. They took years of experimentation and fine-tuning to develop, and believe it or not, it all started with one of the least action-oriented series in gaming history: early Resident Evil.
Let's rock, baby.
It's relatively common knowledge that DMC started its life as a failed version of Resident Evil 4, but I don't think people realize just how much that rings true in the final product. Early Resident Evil's bloody fingerprints are all over every single aspect of this first entry to the series, in more ways than just the engine. In fact, going back to the first DMC after having played a modern entry is incredibly jarring. The combat is far slower and heftier than anything you'll see from the third title on. You might as a modern player wonder why this game was able to kickstart the character action genre, with its multi-second sword swings, slow weapon switching, and complete lack of jump canceling. Understanding that comes from an understanding of Resident Evil and the gaming climate that surrounded DMC 1's release. Resident Evil 1 and 2 are far more rooted in the adventure genre than anything else. Their combat is practically turn-based and requires pretty much zero skill beyond resource management and spacing. Considering how Jill Valentine and Chris Redfield moved at the time, 2001 Dante's now ponderous and almost sluggish attacks would have felt like the most blisteringly fast third-person action in history, because at the time, it was. I'm sure at the time, DMC 1 made players feel just as frantic and bloodthirsty as DMC 5 does today. All this to say that while DMC 1 is certainly still an action game, it's going to make a lot more sense if you've played the early Resident Evil games, particularly Resident Evil 1 Remake. Right from the opening cutscene, you'll see one of the things that sets DMC apart from its Resident Evil roots, though: its tone. There's no part of Devil May Cry that's trying to suggest to you that it's a horror game. By this time, Resident Evil itself was slowly dispensing with its own survival horror ethos, but DMC is something else entirely. Trish jumps out of the sky looking like she came straight out of the Matrix, and Dante comes off as a slightly more juvenile noir-style detective running the seedy, eponymous demon hunting agency. It's a classic noir setup with a demonic twist, right down to the mysterious femme fatale who commissions the grizzled PI's services. Before you're done watching the opening cutscene, Dante has already been electrocuted, kicked in the face, stabbed through the chest, electrocuted again, and shot a motorbike in half in midair. Nothing about that says you should be getting ready to be scared right now. It says, this guy's a near-immortal badass, and you two are about to kick ass and take names for 6 hours straight. To top it off, the voice acting in this first title is just absolute jank. So the cutscene is, from moment one to moment done, intrinsically hilarious. The jankiness of DMC 1 is part of the charm, though. It has that perfect mixture of late 90s edge and early Japanese game localization that leads to gems like this.
I should have been the one to fill your dark soul with light!
You guys sure you don't want another take of that? No? Alright, sounds good, let's ship it. I joke, but in all seriousness, what separates the hilarious jank moments of DMC from the hilarious jank moments of Resident Evil? Again, the tone is the key. Where Resident Evil is earnestly trying to be a horror game from the bottom to the top, DMC has always been at least partially camp from its very inception. While DMC dabbles in dark fantasy, it's endlessly joyful in its execution because of Dante. That joyful, campy execution makes the Jill sandwich moments of DMC add to the experience rather than detracting from it, and pretty much insulates the series from the possibility of punching the boulder. You might not believe me now, but of all the titles in the DMC series, the first game is probably the most grounded. The entire series exists within two worlds at once, the first being the world of action comedy camp, and the second being an epic occult family drama that spans the entire series. I'll dive into why I think that duality works more when it becomes more directly relevant in DMC 3. But the same tonal center of balancing camp with the serious threat that Mundus presents absolutely still drives DMC 1. When considering the jank moments of DMC 1, you also have to remember that this isn't really even a fully realized project yet. It was supposed to be a completely different game until about halfway through its production. For most of the development process, Kamiya and his team thought that they were making an action horror game, so this pivot to a more action fantasy framing would have required an entirely new script. Even with that new script, though, the basic structure couldn't be changed. DMC 1, to a T, follows the exact structure of an early Resident Evil title. It's certainly more linear than Resident Evil 1 or 2, but the bones are all there. Isolated exploration of an ostentatious and dangerous building, check. First trip through that building where you discover a path out. Check. Trip outside the main location to a secondary location where you retrieve a key item. Check. Return trip to the first location, but this time with a horrific twist. Check. Final additional endgame realm where you fight the final boss and have an escape sequence. Check, check, checkity check. It's all here down to the last beat where the big boss monster surprises you with a final attack on the way out. The only thing that's missing is the rocket launcher. Here, you'll simply have to settle for grenades. The firearms of DMC1 are actually a curious case in relation to much of the rest of the franchise. Guns in later DMC games will have many purposes, but the one they have in DMC1 is largely unique to the first game alone. DMC1 is the only game in the entire series where guns are consistently legitimate damage dealers. In another touch that's reminiscent of Resident Evil, the firearms of DMC1 are used frequently in combat as a way of dispatching enemies. Ebony and Ivory are on the weaker side as your starting pistols, but by the time you've gotten the grenade launcher and invested in some extensions to your Devil Trigger gauge, you can kill most enemies at a range, and will often rely on damage from these high-power guns to kill bosses. Firearms aren't as stylish as your Devil Arms, but they are very effective. Griffin, the giant flying boss that you fight in the Colosseum, will fold like origami if you have the grenade launcher equipped. That is, of course, assuming you find the grenade launcher. Dante does actually have to find his weapons on Malay Island. This is something that was done away with completely once the series fully established itself outside of Resident Evil's shadow, but in the first DMC, it's totally possible to completely miss weapons. In my playthrough for the video, I was continually wondering when I would get the shotgun. As it turns out, I had in fact completely missed the shotgun on my first trip through the castle. DMC1 features the bare bones of Resident Evil-style exploration without the depth of resource management that usually comes with and makes that exploration feel purposeful. This isn't to say that DMC1 is bad by any means, quite the contrary. Even with DMC1's quasi-finished feeling, it was still popular and memorable enough to start an entire separate series in its own image. This first entry, though, is never truly allowed to be what I think Kamiya and his team wanted it to be. Yeah, the action is faster paced than Resident Evil, but they hadn't quite discovered the combat system that would yield the genuine anime-style badassery that would come in DMC 3, 4, and 5. Unlike the original Resident Evil, which is largely considered to be an unimpeachably great game from a gameplay perspective, DMC1 hits about 50-50 when it comes to how much it affects the later titles in the series. So thus far, I've talked about what DMC1 takes from Resident Evil and why, in many ways, those things weigh the game down. In light of all that information, what makes DMC1 actually work as well as it does? Well, there are a few things, not the least of which is Dante himself. To this point in time, Dante has not just been the poster boy for DMC, he is DMC. Every single game in the series features him to some extent, and that is because Dante is integral to what makes Devil May Cry work. You can really tell that Kamiya knew from the start the exact character archetype he wanted Dante to be. There's an interview from the time of release where Kamiya talks about what drives Dante in the original game. Quote, Dante talks to devils like he doesn't care, but he's carrying sadness and spiteful feelings because his family was killed by devils, so his mind can't be calm like water without a wave. He's not going to be scared, but his mind is burning with anger. But if he lets the devils know about his feelings, the devils provoke and try to hurt his feelings. So he pretends to be calm and keeps pretending. Then in the end, he can't keep doing it anymore and his story climaxes. End quote. Then later in the interview he says, quote, the beauty of keeping feelings inside is really the Japanese way, I think. But I wanted to create not always a mad or calm character. The character has liveliness. End quote. Earlier I referenced the fact that the DMC series works largely because of the contradictory tones that it balances. The reason the series is able to balance those tonalities the way it does is Dante. Dante is often cocky, quippy, and self-assured, but the writing and performance is good enough, even here in the first game when it's at its thinnest, that you can tell those things are a facade. There's a rage and sadness behind Dante's attitude that comes across in Drew Coombs' performance. Something that's actually improved by later entries to the series. Dante is a superhuman, yes, but with emphasis on the human bit, a trait that will become core to his character over time. Despite what his cocky attitude and demonic heritage might make you think at first glance, he's a total goody two-shoes. Dante doesn't really partake in any of the traditional vices that a character who's designed in the image of a badass action hero might. He doesn't drink, he doesn't smoke, and while he does flirt with other characters at times, there's a running joke in the fanbase that Dante is a virgin and doesn't even know what sex is. Despite his exterior, he's one of the nicest guys in the entire series. Dante's character, with some light exceptions, remains consistent, and develops believably throughout the entire mainline series. He's the narrative and emotional linchpin of everything, and his own internal struggles of being a half-devil mirror the tone of the series itself. Without Dante, the original DMC wouldn't have worked. Full stop. The other major pillar of DMC1's success is obvious: the combat system. While I've stressed that the pace and feeling of combat in DMC1 is very different from the later games, what's more important is what the first game established that has rung true for over 20 years. Not only are many pieces of Dante's kit from this first game mainstays of the series, their inputs have remained completely unchanged. Dante's combat verbs are dictated by his devil arms, supernatural weapons that are the embodiment of a demon that has been defeated in combat. Throughout the entire series, there are certain archetypes of devil arms that appear frequently, two of which are established right here: the Devil Sword Alastor and the Gauntlet Ifrit. Here, those two weapons are the only devil arms that Dante has access to, outside of the late-game inclusion of Devil Sword Sparta. But in almost every single entry to the mainline saga, there's some variation on these two themes. No matter what point you're at in the series, Dante has a Devil Gauntlet and a Devil Sword. It's because of these two archetypes' omnipresence that DMC1's combat still bears a strong resemblance to the combat of later titles. Alastor's moveset is similar to Sparta's, is similar to Rebellion's, is similar to Devil Sword Dante's, all the way down the line. And the same is true for Ifrit, Beowulf, Gilgamesh, and Balrog. There's long-term muscle memory across titles, but just enough variation between each iteration of the arm to make it feel like you're using something similar, but still distinct. High Time, Stinger, Helmbreaker, and even the three basic Alastor combos exist across all of the Devil Swords with the same inputs. This is slightly less true with Ifrit's moveset, but even there's some variant of Kick 13, Drive Kick, and Magma Drive that has existed on every single Gauntlet Devil Arm. This muscle memory makes it much easier later on when titles begin to ask Dante to hot swap between multiple Devil Arms, even though that's not really properly achievable here in the first game. The other major factor that makes DMC1's combat work is what I mentioned in the introduction: its simplicity. DMC1 only really has a few relevant inputs: jump on cross, devil arm on triangle, gun on square, devil trigger on left bumper, lock on right bumper. There's really very few variables to keep track of here in the first title, and the mappings on the controller are the same as they'll be for the entirety of the series. DMC's mechanical identity, while not fully realized here in the first title, is still defined by the simplistic controller mapping that was created in 2001. Weapon skills, therefore, aren't bound to a long and complicated series of inputs with multiple directionals like you'd see in fighting games at an arcade. They're largely bound to one directional and one button. Forward plus triangle equals Stinger. Backward plus triangle equals High Time. Triangle, triangle, triangle equals basic combo. It would seem that this would mean Dante is bound to a very limited moveset, but DMC then uses other variables besides inputs to expand the moveset further. Timing, aerials, weapon choice, all of these will affect the output that's associated with a given input. This creates a combat system that's very simple to engage with, but has a massive amount of depth, even here in the first title. It lacks the speed and savagery of the combat in the later titles that truly allows you to enter the DMC flow state. But make no mistake, at the time this was a revolutionary single-player variation on fighting game formulas. Rather than combat being based around memorizing a moveset full of 10 to 15 unique and brutally different combos, you tie an action to the simple movement of the analog stick and the pressing of the triangle button. Only the basic ground combos rely on multiple presses of the triangle button. Any move that changes a variable, such as moving from the ground to the air, or the air to the ground, relies on just one press of the attack button in conjunction with a related movement input. Your job is to memorize these simple inputs, and learn how to chain them together as effectively as possible, a feat for which you're graded live on screen. This is the last piece of the puzzle that made DMC1, and all of the subsequent games' combat what they are: the stylish system. It's not quite finished here in the first title, but there's no mistaking the fact that the style grading system of DMC is absolutely one of its most important and visionary design features. This too is inherited from the world of fighting games, but simplified and turned into a perfect dopamine delivery system for a single-player experience. Rather than telling you literally how many hits you've chained together like a fighter would, DMC simply tells you how stylish you are. What that means here in DMC 1 is simply whether you're fluidly chaining attacks together without stopping. Style rankings are tied to letter grade rankings, just like you'd see on a tier list nowadays, but more importantly, very similar to what you'd receive in school. D for dull, C for cool, B for bravo, A for absolute, and S for stylish. The game is literally tapping into the exact neural pathways that are created by some of your earliest ingrained reward stimuli, to make you either feel incredible because of how well you're doing, or make you want to get better because of the negative feedback on the low end of the grading system. When you get a D in a DMC combat encounter, on some level the game is tapping into every single time you got back a grade on a test that you feel like you could have done better on. It's telling you that sure, you made it through the encounter, but you didn't really master the material now, did you? Now, obviously this could be a bias on my part. I've always been school-oriented, which should be evident from the fact that I'm a graduate student. That said, I think that DMC tying its combo system subconsciously to the grades that students receive in school would to some extent be effective to literally every person who's been through that system, regardless of how much they wound up caring about it long term. The games even give you a report card at the end that tells you how well you did on all the different missions. Did you pass with flying colors, or were you barely scraping by with D's and C's the entire time? When you get an A or an S in a DMC mission or combat encounter, on some level, you're being reminded of that time you brought home a good report card and your parents told you they were proud of you or gave you $5 or whatever stimulus have you. I don't know how much of a conscious choice this was on the part of the development team, but when I say that this is the single greatest contribution to game design that DMC1 makes, I mean it. This simple design decision has rippled down through the ages in the gaming consciousness. To this day, tier lists are still written from D to S, and that ranking system is used in the gaming world because of Devil May Cry. It's part of every single entry to the series, and has only expanded over time. There's simply no greater feeling than slowly climbing through the ranks during a combat encounter, seeing that S rank flash across the screen, and then maintaining it. It's tough in DMC1 too, actually considerably tougher than most of the later games. Style ranks decay faster than any other title in the series, and one mistake will often reduce you from an S rank to absolute 0. The system is quite unforgiving, to the point that it was actually very difficult for me to obtain an S rank in any given combat encounter. I think it only really happened a couple of times in my playthrough, and on a mission, forget about it. Part of that is owing to the fact that DMC1 just hasn't really finalized the combat system, but the other part is absolutely the simple fact that the grading system is that punishing here. Later games will progressively make combo maintenance easier, but also change the requirements. The first game only requires players to string together as many attacks as possible. Variation is actually not a factor, which is honestly a pretty big oversight in a game about style. Later on, the devs would correct this oversight, but here in DMC1, you can just shotgun hike for as long as you want and the style gauge will increase, so long as you don't get hit. I never got that invested in DMC1's combat, but there are people who are. It just doesn't have that same polish that the later titles will, and generally if I'm going to play one of them for fun outside of the story mode, it's not going to be the first game. Still though, even with the fact that DMC1 hasn't completely codified the series experience, the skeleton is all here. The original title establishes most of what makes the series enjoyable, addicting, and iconic. It just wasn't fully ready to step out of the shadow of its sister series. It would take time, careful development, and a lot of thought to expand upon the great systems and aesthetics of DMC1 in such a way that it would feel like a natural and positive evolution of the franchise. So of course, in their infinite wisdom, the suits at Capcom greenlit a sequel and made sure that it was developed under horrible conditions in less than 2 years. Before playing the games, I kept wondering why I had basically never heard anything about DMC2. DMC1 invented the character action game, 3 perfected it, 4 had the strong systems but weak level design, and 5 was the triumphant return. DMC2, though, I had basically never heard mentioned. It does, however, have a reputation. DMC2 is the bad one. I rarely think that most bad installments in a series deserve the vitriolic reputations that fanbases give them. When I started playing DMC2, I didn't really understand why people hated it so much. But the longer I spent with it, the more what was wrong with it came through. DMC2 isn't on paper terrible. It is, in fact, a game, which is more than can be said for most of the worst Trashfire projects out there. No, instead DMC2 suffers from a number of smaller issues which compound into a severely deficient final product. The worst problems are the most immediately noticeable. Dante just doesn't move like he did in the original game. Now, changing the pace and the rhythm of combat aren't impossible feats in DMC. In fact, it happens with pretty much every title. Each of the games has a slightly different feel to the rhythm of combat, and each one takes a bit of getting used to in its own right. It's only in DMC2, though, where the combat just feels wrong. There's something that's missing here. It simply lacks the sauce. Dante is absurdly floaty and far more sluggish than he was in the original game, and there's a distinct lack of heft to any of his movements. When you threw a stinger in DMC1, Dante would blitz forward with a powerful stab and a HYAH! That left an impact. In DMC2, that motion becomes more like a clumsy 3 or 4 steps forward, accompanied by a light whimper. All of Dante's moves in DMC2 are like this. There's no weight behind the motions, but there's no speed either, which leaves everything feeling sorta hollow. DMC1's combat doesn't have the blistering fast pace of the later titles, but Dante could be relied upon to feel consistently powerful and rewarding to control. The loss of that feeling shoots DMC2 in the foot from moment one, and once you've messed up the action, it's all downhill from there. Dante's movement isn't the only problem with his presentation in DMC2. I mentioned in the previous chapter that Dante's personality is key to how DMC maintains its clashing tonalities, and creates an atmosphere with both relentless fun and stakes. In a lot of ways, Dante should be like Spider-Man. Constantly quipping at and clowning on his opponents is a sort of battle cry for Dante in the same way that it is for Peter Parker. There's no world wherein Dante is a serious, no-nonsense action hero. No world, that is, except for the world of DMC2. You can tell from the very opening cutscene that Dante's personality has just been completely erased in DMC2. There's not even a hint of the person he was in the first game. He's joyless, he never smiles, and he never makes jokes. The tone of DMC2 is just totally off and completely disjointed, which makes sense when you consider the history of its development. DMC1, as I discussed, was helmed by Hideki Kamiya, and produced by a small team at Capcom called Team Little Devils. DMC2 was developed by a completely different team. This team was eventually helmed by Hideaki Itsuno, who would himself go on to direct or supervise the entire remainder of the series. Here in the second title, though, he joined the process last minute, replacing the team's original director, not having been involved whatsoever with the original game's production. In fact, neither he nor any of the newly founded Team Devil had worked on any 3D action game before. Development on DMC2 was actually underway before the first game had even shipped, which is absolutely fucking crazy. How on earth was the team supposed to create a successful sequel to a game before even knowing what had worked and what hadn't in the original title? Without having worked on the original game, the development team wouldn't have known how to make Dante move in the right way. Without having seen the original game release, the fanbase's love of Dante's wisecracking character was not yet established. Team Devil had been thoroughly set up to fail by Capcom on numerous levels, and that is important to note when discussing the failures of DMC2. It isn't purely the development team's fault that the game ended up a disjointed mess. Capcom itself, like is often the case, is more to blame than any individual developer or development team. The chaotic development history of DMC2 rings through in just about every aspect of the experience. The game's narrative is probably the best example of this. I legitimately don't think I could tell you what the story of DMC2 is without looking it up online. I believe the idea is that Arius, the evil Mr. Bad Guy, wants to summon some kind of powerful demon in order to gain power and/or destroy the world. Something along those lines, anyway. I know he's taken over Lucia's homeland and she wants him dead because of it, but other than that, things are very vague. The game feels more like a loose collection of half-finished levels, with the odd cutscene to paper over the cracks here and there. Playing DMC2 brings to mind the vibe of a fever dream. Completely disjunct areas blend together, as though it was just totally normal for you to go from what seems to be an impoverished desert community to a 21st century metropolis, to an oil rig, to an ancient demon ruin, with no real connective tissue explaining why or how Dante is moving from place to place. It's pretty jarring, and makes the whole experience very confusing. Yet this too makes sense when you begin to consider the development context of DMC2. DMC2 comes from the very tail end of the arcade era. By 2001, when DMC2 began development, the arcades were terminally ill, sputtering and gasping against the throes of death. What had once been the most lucrative market for gaming was now being relegated to the side corners of bowling alleys and movie theaters, as home consoles began to eclipse even the best of what arcades could offer. Companies that for the last decade had been splitting their development teams and efforts across both home console and the arcade were now beginning to shutter those sides of their production studios that were rapidly becoming obsolete. Due to this transitory development period, many members of Team Devil were pulled from Capcom Studio One, which had primarily been focused on arcade development. When a game is built for the arcade, there are drastically different design demands from a game developed for the home console. Arcade games are not intended to be completed. In fact, if players are regularly completing an arcade game, it's probably actively failing at its job. They're art designed to be consumed mainly in part and rarely in whole, unless of course the player is supremely skilled or willing to shell out their entire life savings in quarters. In such an environment, developers couldn't be sure that players would see level 2, let alone the entire game, and as such, narrative cohesion was basically a non-starter. This isn't to say that arcade games that are artistically cohesive don't exist at all. In fact, some of the most famous cabinets are the ones that do have that feeling of being a complete whole, like House of the Dead. These, however, are the exceptions to the rule. Play an arcade game for more than one level, and you'll likely experience a series of levels that bear basically no resemblance to one another because they're designed to provide as much variety as possible within about 10 to 20 minutes of play at most. If you actually try to pay full attention to an arcade game, it'll have this exact same fever dream type feel that DMC2 has, never really staying in one place long enough for it to feel real, never really feeling like there's a true logical continuity between any two play environments. DMC2 is, at its core, an arcade game that was stretched like silly putty in order to fit the PS2, and as anyone who's played with silly putty before would know, stretch it far enough and holes begin to form. What's most interesting, though, is that despite DMC2's general poor quality and reception, it still establishes a number of design elements that would ring down throughout much of the rest of the series. For example, many might attribute Dante's famous sword Rebellion to DMC3, the game where it makes one of its most iconic appearances. That sword, however, comes from DMC2. That's right. One of Dante's most iconic design flourishes was established in the single worst outing in the entire series. Rebellion is a great devil arm with its massive blade and skeleton hilt. It's just the right intersection of heavy metal anime camp and badass threatening design to perfectly match Dante as a character, and future teams would correctly make this Dante's go-to devil sword. I was also shocked when, during a boss fight, I transformed into what seemed to be Dante's Sin Devil Trigger form from DMC5. It's not quite the same thing. The mechanic is actually called Desperation Devil Trigger and comes from Dante activating DT while he's critically low on HP, but the design is almost exactly the same and originated here. DMC2 also evolves the series' relationship to the Resident Evil franchise in ways that I would actually argue are largely for the better. Playing DMC1, there's often a sense that you're just playing a Resident Evil game with swords and no inventory management. The fixed camera angles of the early Resident Evil games ill-fit the more fast-paced action of DMC1, and DMC2, while not fully allowing the player to control the camera, pivots to a style that involves a more zoomed-out perspective. These perspectives make it much easier to see what's going on in most combat encounters, and track Dante's movement. Similarly, while combat doesn't really feel good, DMC2 does move closer to the way that combat will operate in much of the rest of the series. Guns are much less effective than they were in the first game, at least outside of Devil Trigger. and combat has become far more melee-focused. The game even adds function to the circle button that would become the style button in DMC3. Sure, Dante's evades in DMC2 feel like sluggish floaty crap, but they were still a step on the way to inventing the trickster style. The game is starting to feel a little bit more like its own thing, and even, dare I say, a little bit more like the DMC series we all know and love from the third installment forward. Sure, it's not properly realized at all in this second installment, but there is a marked feeling of this being the growing pains that would eventually create the incredible combat of the next game. DMC2 also takes the only cue from Resident Evil that would become more involved over the course of the series. Almost every Resident Evil features 2 or more protagonists. The early titles usually have separate campaigns for their protagonists, while the later games would begin to weave them together more. DMC2 is the first game in the series to feature a secondary protagonist, Lucia, and many of the later games will feature multiple protagonists as well. I would argue that the multiple protagonist approach actually works better in DMC than it does in any Resident Evil title. When you're working with an action title, there's a lot more room for protagonists to feel as though they have completely unique fighting styles. Characters in DMC don't usually play at all alike. They have their own completely unique combat rhythms, abilities, and button mappings. We'll discuss that in more depth later, though. Here it is, in keeping with the rest of DMC2, pretty half-baked. Dante and Lucia play largely the same. Sure, Lucia doesn't use actual guns, but in terms of their actual combat rhythms and manner of play, they feel almost exactly the same. Still though, DMC2 established this trend for the series, even if it isn't quite at its fullest potential. Unfortunately, even with its slight changes and updates to the original game's formula, DMC2 doesn't really stick the landing in pretty much any regard. Nothing is really properly functional or thought out, and every aspect of its design pales in comparison to the rest of the series. It's an interesting transitional fossil, but there's very little fun to be had in the actual playing of the thing. That lack of fun played out in the critical reception of the title, but not the financial reception. Apparently, Capcom's strategy worked, and sold relatively well hot on the heels of its acclaimed and popular predecessor, despite its lackluster reception. I would imagine that players of the original game felt pretty duped by this overly hasty and slapdash sequel, but luckily the next title would serve as a proper reawakening for the franchise.
Want to know the name? Devil May Cry.
After the mixed reception of DMC2, the series was in need of a proper redefinition. DMC was quickly outgrowing its Resident Evil roots, but hadn't quite found its own identity as a series. That identity starts here. It's fitting that DMC3 is called Dante's Awakening, because this is where the series finally, truly finds its footing. DMC3 is one of the most visionary and perfect action games ever made. While the original game is the first real character action game, DMC3 is the template that literally every single character action game afterward follows, including its own successors. 3 games into the series, and we finally have our first game that actually feels like a complete and finalized product. Third time's the charm, I suppose. You can feel the fact that DMC3 has finally escaped its origins in Resident Evil right away, and for one very specific reason: the camera angle. Where the first 2 games inherited Resident Evil's fixed camera angles, DMC3 finally has a camera that changes focus relative to the player character. Early Resident Evil's fixed camera angles are iconic and serve several fantastic artistic purposes to those games. They were, however, extremely ill-fitting for a character action series. The fixed camera angles of DMC1 often got in the way of that game's wonderful combat systems by making it difficult to track Dante's motion. When you're moving around as much as a character action game requires, a relative camera angle is almost a complete necessity. What's most interesting about DMC3's implementation, though, is that it doesn't ditch the fixed camera angles completely. There are some situations wherein the fixed camera angles remain, but they're rarely in combat encounters. When exploring the tower of Temen Nigru, the fixed camera angles sometimes make great pictures, like in the main chamber. These occasional fixed camera shots, though, are a vestigial organ to DMC3. They neither add a great deal nor take much away, and more than anything, they feel like the last gasps of Resident Evil's influence over the franchise before the two decidedly move away from one another. The most important aspect of DMC3, though, is the main man himself, or perhaps main men. In an excellent course correction from DMC2, Dante is back to his old self, and better than ever. Arkham, the totally not evil bad guy, comes to Dante inviting him to clash with Vergil, after which he is promptly stabbed about 10 times and then guns down a horde of demons with shirtless gun fu while hard rock blares in the background. It's fucking perfect. This characterization of Dante is the one that will truly endure. The angry, brash, and headstrong show-off with a punk rock affect and a devil may care attitude. It's almost as though the development team heard the critiques of Dante's character in DMC 2 and overcorrected. But that overcorrection took the character to where he always should have been in the first place. Everything that we know Dante for today, the one-liners, the new weapon dances, the in-combat quips, it all comes from right here in DMC 3. It's endlessly joyful in a very similar way that the modern Doom games are. To Dante, petty combat encounters are ultimately a game, just like it is to the player, which means that you'll be in almost 100% sync with him from minute 1 to minute done. I've mentioned, however, that DMC as a franchise has always balanced contradictory tonalities, a duality between the joyful and brash exterior of Dante and the deadly serious demonic threat that he's answering. In a move that would be the most defining for the franchise's identity, perhaps ever, DMC3 externalizes and literalizes that tonal duality in its antagonist, Vergil. Vergil was mentioned in DMC1 and appeared as Nello Angelo, a recurring boss, but his presence isn't really genuinely felt there. He's a minion of Mundus first and foremost, and doesn't really show off any of his own character. Sure, Dante reacts upon finding out that Vergil is under the armor, but it's not really Vergil, and the audience doesn't really know Vergil. DMC3 changed that in a huge way. It's well known that Vergil is the main antagonist of the DMC series, but that didn't become the case until DMC3. Dante and Vergil are two of Capcom's most iconic characters ever, and yet one of them didn't even exist until the third installment. That stance and fame, however, are well deserved, because Vergil is just that fucking good. Dante and Vergil are, essentially, perfect mirror images of one another. Where Dante is brash and reckless, Vergil is cold and calculating. Where Dante puts his human side first, Vergil prioritizes his demonic side. Dante's style of combat is flamboyant and ostentatious, where Vergil's is precise and elegant. Dante uses modern weaponry like guns and gaudy devil arms with a million bells and whistles, while Vergil despises guns and wields his simple, iconic devil katana Yamato. Dante is red, Vergil is blue. Twin brothers who can never abide one another due to their contradictory natures. It's a very Eastern philosophy, yin and yang, applied to popular culture in such a way that DMC3 feels like an honest-to-God modern myth at times. All this in the same game where Dante turns a sexy demon lady into an electric guitar sword that shoots lightning bats. This sense of DMC3 being a modern myth might actually be my favorite thing about the game. That aforementioned duality just feels so goddamn correct. This mixture of mythical tones and Dante's modern affectation are exactly what the DMC series needed to finish finding its narrative footing. The idea of two inexorable forces irrevocably at odds with one another is one of the oldest myths in human history, and just like the grading system taps into your earliest reward pathways, the mythical framing taps into some of the world's most well-known narrative structures. Dante and Vergil are demigods for the 21st century, and DMC3 feels like it. I mean, technically they're Cambions, but Sparta is really more like a minor god than a demon in DMC's mythology, so I'd consider them demigods. Romulus and Remus, reimagined as taciturn samurai and wisecracking gunslinger. Their sibling rivalry makes sense too from a human perspective. Vergil and Dante have canonically fought since they were children, the death of their mother causing each to move to an opposite extreme. Vergil's obsession with power comes from a genuine desire to protect those he loves, and Dante's rejection of it comes from a fear of what he would become if he were to truly embrace his demonic heritage. That fear will prove well-founded in DMC5, but here in DMC3 the conflict is simple and personal. Sparta's power is up for grabs. One of the brothers wants it, and the other doesn't want him to have it. It's a conflict with large and small stakes, which is what made the myths of ancient times compelling to begin with. Just like the gods and demigods of old, Dante and Vergil, as beings of immense power beyond that of a normal human being, have family conflicts that are just as personal, but have much farther-reaching ramifications than a normal family would. Vergil wants and feels entitled to inherit the power of his father, but doesn't realize that power is, inherently, a corruptive force. In fact, he won't learn that lesson until the end of the current timeline. But as early as DMC3, it's very obvious in the visual language of the series. The most powerful beings, the game's demons, are all horrendously ugly and/or obviously evil. Arkham, the main villain, has forsaken his humanity in search of demonic power, and it's obviously physically and mentally destroying him. His own daughter, Mary, renamed Lady by her own choice at the end of the game, wants him dead. And when he finally does absorb Sparta's power, he becomes a disgusting purple blob. Lady herself actually plays into this theme as well. She's actually the only member of the DmC crew who's fully human. And yet she can still kick demon ass just as effectively as Dante does. Yes, she has to use different tools, since she probably couldn't handle close-quarters combat with a demon, but as a pure human being, she's strong enough to climb the tower and even challenge Dante. You get the sense that the only real reason she loses to Dante in the narrative of the game is her inexperience. The two are roughly the same age, but Dante has been fighting since birth, and Lady has only recently taken up her bazooka spear in hopes of killing her father. With time, she comes into her own as a demon hunter, just as skilled and effective as Trish and Dante, without a drop of demonic blood in her veins. It gets to the point that she's leaving Nero behind, who, according to Vergil and Arkham's worldview, should be inherently stronger. One of the major thematic through lines of Dante and Vergil's trilogy-spanning sibling rivalry is that gaining more power pretty much never leads to a positive result, and that theme is demonstrated further in the third game through Lady and Arkham. This new central conflict, the apocalyptic sibling rivalry between Vergil and Dante, becomes the central focus of DmC from here forward, to the point where DmC 3, 4, and 5 form a sort of loose trilogy with one another, known as the Sons of Sparta arc to fans. The entire series' identity is defined by DmC 3 in a way that it hadn't been previously. Sure, the combat system has been taking shape, and many of the visionary design decisions have been around since the very first title, but it wasn't until DmC 3 that the series fully had its own identity. To emphasize even further just how far the series has come from its Resident Evil roots, despite being gift-wrapped the perfect setup for the dual protagonist approach, DmC 3's original release focused exclusively on the conflict from Dante's perspective. The Vergil campaign wasn't added until the Special Edition a year after the initial release, and even there it feels like an afterthought. It adds the bare minimum additional narrative content from Vergil's perspective, and doesn't even feature a Dante boss in place of the Vergil bosses in the main campaign. You just fight Red Vergil, which is frankly pretty lame. Alongside the solidification of the series' narrative and aesthetic identity, DmC 3 is also famous for solidifying its mechanical identity. The most important addition to the series' combat comes right here. It's not a gun, it's not a devil arm, and it's not a combo. It's the seemingly humble enemy step. When I first played DmC 5 and saw enemy step as a purchasable ability in the upgrade screen, I thought it was utterly useless. I went into DmC 5 knowing next to nothing about the series, so I had no idea just how integral enemy step was to actually using the combat system. In DmC 3, enemy step is an intrinsic part of Dante's movement kit, and honestly, I think it should have stayed that way, because it's just that important. The problem is that not one title in the series properly explains the full extent of enemy step's usefulness. In later titles, it's described as the ability to double jump off an enemy, which seems at first glance to be completely useless. The utility comes in with the fact that jumping off an enemy brings with it the now legendary jump cancel. Jump canceling is required to succeed at DmC combat. When your character's in the air, certain moves can only be performed one time before returning to the ground. That is, unless you jump off something in midair, which resets that move allowance and makes it possible to stay airborne for longer. Enemies are largely helpless in the air, and your character is much harder to hit, making aerial combat far more desirable than ground combat. Not getting hit means less likelihood to die, and continuity of the style rank, which means far better performance overall. Jump canceling, as such, is one of the most important skills to learn if you want to reach beyond beginner-level engagement with DmC combat. Some players, through a mixture of jump canceling, weapon swapping, and style switching, can perform ludicrous combos without ever touching the ground. Naturally, mastering the movement and combat systems to the extent that this becomes possible takes massive amounts of time and practice, but once you figure it out, you can start getting some pretty respectable combos going relatively quickly. DmC 3 is also the first game where hot-swapping weapons and firearms mid-combat becomes not only possible, but mandatory for higher-level play. Hot swapping in later titles will become more complicated, but here in DMC 3, it's actually pretty manageable. Dante can have 2 devil arms and 2 firearms equipped at a time, swappable with the right and left triggers respectively. I feel like that's the exact right amount for the human brain to comprehend. While devil arms largely use the same few inputs to function, those inputs can have vastly different movement outcomes, and can sometimes move you in completely opposite directions. Remembering 2 movesets is just the right amount for me as a player, and so Dante's system in DMC 3 resonates with me. In later titles, you'll be asked to juggle 4 or more devil arms and firearms at the same time, which creates a much greater degree of confusion when stringing together combos, especially when you begin to take styles into account as well. DMC 3 introduces Dante's style system, which essentially changes the function of the circle button on the controller depending on which one you have equipped. Trickster expands Dante's movement kit. Swordmaster gives him new attacks for his devil arms. Gunslinger grants new firearm attacks, and Royal Guard allows you to parry enemy attacks and redirect their damage back to them. There are more styles than just these 4, but for the vast majority of the experience, you'll be limited to one of these. Styles are probably the second biggest thing DMC 3 does to codify the combat system, though their implementation here isn't quite fully realized. Most players are going to just stick to Swordmaster or Trickster, since they're by far the most broadly applicable styles. Aerial combos become largely impossible without access to Swordmaster, since most aerial attacks like Aerial Rave are tied to the circle button, and dodging without access to the movement options provided by Trickster becomes markedly more difficult. Still though, the styles themselves emerged almost fully formed right here in the first implementation. Almost every utility of the style system that's available in DMC 3 remains available and unchanged in subsequent titles. Styles and jump canceling are what make lore-accurate Dante combos possible. They're the final step that takes DMC from a crude early character action game to the blisteringly fast and acrobatic gameplay experience that the series is known for today. The only issue with DMC 3's implementation of the system is its limitation of one style at a time. Only having one of Dante's styles at a time makes the coolest applications of his abilities impossible. Yes, you can access long-form aerial combos through the use of Swordmaster and jump canceling, but now your movement is significantly limited without access to Trickster. Trickster and Gunslinger both make aerial combos far easier to accomplish, but the moment you equip either one of them, you lose access to the vast majority of Dante's aerial kit that comes along with Swordmaster. It's the one kink in an absolutely incredible system, something which Capcom themselves acknowledged subtly when they included the Freeform mode in the DMC 3 re-release for Nintendo Switch. Freeform essentially retroactively adds style switching to DMC 3, but that functionality wasn't present at all in any prior iteration of the game. After their failed first attempt, Team Devil essentially built their own completely new combat system from the ground up, and that risk paid off massively in the playing of the game. DMC 3 to this day feels incredible to play and way ahead of its time. Most action games released today don't even come close to the same level of quality. It's a good thing that DMC 3 feels so good to play, too, because you'll be bashing your head against the wall quite frequently throughout its runtime. DMC 3 is one of the most notoriously difficult games in history. Going in, I actually didn't know just how difficult DMC 3 was, and I learned the hard way. Especially in comparison to the first 2 games, DMC 3's combat is shockingly punishing, particularly during boss encounters. Enemies and bosses alike are far more aggressive than they had been before or have been since. I wasn't keeping a direct count or anything, but I'm fairly certain I died more times in my playthroughs of DMC 3 than I did in any other title but my playthrough of 5. There is, however, one key difference between those playthroughs. When I played DMC 3 for this video, I was playing on the normal difficulty. When I played DMC 5 for this video, I was playing on Dante Must Die, DMC's very hard mode. Cerberus alone in DMC 3 killed me more than 10 times, and he's the first boss, and don't even get me started on Vergil 3. The next time somebody acts like Dark Souls is hard, please kindly introduce them to DMC 3, because holy shit, it makes the Dark Souls games look like a fucking merry-go-round. This level of difficulty has been one of the major bits of cultural staying power for DMC 3. Its infamous difficulty actually spawned several early internet memes, from "now I'm motivated" to "easy mode is now selectable," a message which I can in fact confirm I received. The thing is though, I never really felt like selecting easy mode even when it was offered to me. DMC3's combat feels good enough that you rarely get frustrated with it, even if you're bashing your head against a boss for double-digit attempts. Dante's cool factor also makes you as the player strive to be as cool as he is, or at least as close as you can get, and lowering the difficulty mode would have felt far less cool to me than rising to the challenge. For all of Vergil's talk of motivation, it was Dante who motivated me. It's honestly somewhat difficult to talk about DMC3 because there's really only so long I can go on saying, yeah, it was good then and it's still good now. Most of the things I could say about it have been said, and there's very little wrong with it as a game. The tone is right where it needs to be for the series. The characters are exactly who they need to be for this game. The combat is finally coming into its own and reaching the form that we know and love. It's pretty much a perfect storm of action game design, and that fact is self-evident in the playing of the thing. From here on, there's no more need to really innovate or fix any specific aspect of the series. The fundamentals established here will simply be tweaked slightly with each subsequent entry to refine the experience and make things even better.
Devil May Cry.
Devil May Cry 4 is a controversial title for many reasons. After DMC3's stupendous success, DMC4 began development almost immediately. For reference as to how quick I'm talking here, DMC3 released in 2005, and within the same year, there were already teaser images being released for DMC4. This kind of turnaround on a sequel is unheard of nowadays, because development cycles for AAA titles are exponentially longer than they used to be. But, as you'll recall, it isn't exactly unheard of for DMC. The only other title that began development this way, however, was DMC2, which should have been a major red flag for Capcom and the development team. DMC4 is such a strange mixed bag, and in many ways it's reminiscent of the experience of playing DMC2. Unlike the third game, which is a near-perfect complete product, DMC4 iterates upon the gameplay of its predecessor in some genuinely incredible ways, but ultimately feels only about 3/4 of the way finished. The reasons for DMC4's quasi-finished quality seem to be, from the information that I could find, the result of something that I've actually discussed on this channel before: bottom-up design. For those who aren't aware, there are two major schools of game design philosophy: top-down design and bottom-up design. Top-down design is primarily driven by flavor and narrative. The mechanics are crafted around the story, characters, and themes, and not the other way around. Bottom-up design is the opposite, where mechanics come first and the narrative and thematic elements are shaped by the mechanics. DMC4 is pretty much an archetypical example of bottom-up design. Much of the game's development was driven specifically by a desire to figure out how the team could iterate upon the gameplay of the third title so soon after its release. Nero, as a character, only exists as a result of bottom-up design. The developers were trying to think of ways in which they could introduce new gameplay elements when Dante's kit was already so well defined, and found that the best way to do that was by adding a second protagonist. As with the last time I discussed bottom-up design, it's important to note that in no way is it inherently worse as an approach when compared to top-down design. In fact, it's often far more effective. I'd even argue that DMC and action games in general are specifically suited to bottom-up design, as action games tend to live and die by their mechanics. DMC4, however, is one of the cases wherein bottom-up design did not pay off particularly well. The issues at play in DMC4 are classic examples of problems caused by unfinished or sloppy bottom-up design. Issues with narrative coherence, thin characters, coherence of world and level design. All of these are symptoms of poorly executed bottom-up design. While the narratives of DMC 1 and 3 aren't by any means revolutionary, I can at least comprehend them. To be perfectly honest, I still don't really fully know the plot of DMC4. DMC4's narrative is still pretty vague. It's not impossible to follow, but the characters' motivations don't make much sense, and the vast majority of the experience feels like a wild goose chase from a narrative perspective. All in all, it's just kind of a mess, wherein very little is properly explained, and what is properly explained doesn't really contribute to the series' narrative as a whole. While I wouldn't necessarily say this issue is backbreaking in a DMC game, it's a particularly sore spot after DMC 3, whose story was so simple and campy, yet still mythical and emotionally resonant. DMC 4 doesn't do the tonal agility thing particularly well, but it skews in the opposite direction of DMC 2. Where DMC 2 was overly serious and joyless, DMC 4 is so camp that it feels like literally nothing matters. This is the game where Dante fucks off for half of the entire story and basically lets the villain's plans get 99% of the way to fruition, despite the fact that he could seemingly have easily dealt with them the entire time. While Dante does feel in character for the most part here, the misunderstandings that drive a great deal of the narrative are frustrating, and don't really feel like part of his style at this point in his character arc. The Gaming Brit has an excellent breakdown of DMC 4 and where it went wrong narratively, and I think most of his points are pretty accurate. You spend half of the game playing as a new character who we as the audience have basically no attachment to, and then slog back through the same levels in the second half as the fan favorite, effortlessly jobbing the bosses and enemies that were giving the new guy so much trouble in the first place. Not exactly a recipe for success there, and that panned out in the fan reception of the game. DMC 4 also shares one specific thing in common with DMC 2, that being the fever dream level design that I talked about in my chapter on that game. Locations in DMC 4 feel like they couldn't possibly be connected to one another by the sheer differences in the biomes presented. The tower in DMC 3 felt somewhat nonsensical at times, but that was literally an evil demonic tower from the Hell dimension. DMC 4 ostensibly takes place in a real, normal city, and yet somehow that city is simultaneously a sun-drenched, temperate Italianate city that's right next to a gothic castle surrounded by blizzards, and also a decrepit Western-style mining town, and also a tropical forest. Something here is just not quite computing. The world and levels of DMC 4 just don't make sense, and that's on account of its weird fever dream level design. Where DMC 4 diverges strongly from the foibles of the second game is in its combat systems. DMC 4's combat is legendary, even in comparison to the changes made in DMC 3. Firstly, DMC 4 combat is noticeably faster than that of DMC 3. Part of this might be a shift in the console generation, but DMC 4 has by far the fastest pace of combat in the entire series. Enemies are faster, your strikes are faster, and therefore the timing of every major mechanic is much tighter than in any other title. DMC 4 as a game isn't quite as difficult as DMC 3, but mastering it is by far the most difficult in the series, due to its genuinely breakneck speed. It also takes a step back toward its Resident Evil origins by directly and more effectively incorporating that series' dual protagonist stylistic convention. DMC 4 was built from the ground up with multiple protagonists in mind, and they have two completely distinct and separate ways of playing. This too is a little bit of DNA left over from DMC's fighting game ancestors, where players work with completely different movesets and control completely different variables depending on which character they're playing. Each new character in DMC represents, essentially, a different instrument for that player to become proficient with. Sure, you can be great at playing Nero, but that doesn't mean you've mastered Dante or Vergil, and the list grows from there. Here in DMC 4, though, our major characters are Dante and Nero. Nero is the first character that you'll experience in DMC 4, and it's a good thing his gameplay is so great, because he has very little direct narrative relevance to the game. Despite spending most of the game 3 steps behind Dante and getting duped by the various affiliates of Devil May Cry, Nero's gameplay does make him come across as his own distinct character, and feels appropriate to his personality. His strikes are reckless and broad, and his wonderfully massive and preposterous motorcycle sword, Red Queen, coats itself in flames as though it were an extension of his internal rage. You can even feel his recklessness and lack of experience in the way he moves. His strikes feel more like they're dictated by the momentum of the sword rather than the other way around, especially when using Exceed strikes. Execute an EX streak, and Nero will fling himself across the battlefield with such force that he skids several additional feet after the attack is over. Use EX Caliber, and the enemy struck will be blasted backward with force, but out of the reach of further strikes. He's characterized very well through his combat, even if his narrative presence is lacking. The Exceeds mechanic is Nero's unique mechanic. and it's by far my favorite in the entire series. You can rev Red Queen's motorcycle engine to coat the blade in fire and power up Nero's attacks, but doing so manually is slow and cumbersome. The intended pattern of play is to use Nero's exact and max act systems to charge the sword in combat by revving it in proper timing with your attacks. Do this and Nero will be consistently attacking with higher damage output than even Dante. The mechanic is viscerally satisfying on an animal level. Hearing the little each time an exact or max act is successfully executed might just be the single greatest sensory experience in gaming history. Just a perfect little dopamine rush in the midst of what's already deeply satisfying and exhilarating combat. Of course, this timing is difficult to master, and particularly tight here in DMC4. There are only a few frames on each move that are viable for exact timing, and even fewer viable for max act timing. Coming to DMC4 after getting comfortable with Nero in DMC5, the tighter exact timing is actually quite punishing. It's a noticeably smaller window, and I'm glad the developers widened it a bit in the later title. This timing-based gameplay loop, however, means that Nero is all about rhythm. It's for that reason that I call Nero the bass guitar of DMC. Sure, he's got fewer things to keep track of, so you can pick him up a little easier, but actually playing well requires an intimate sense of the rhythm of his strikes, takes just as much practice as a flashier instrument, and can be equally impressive. You can get into a very nice groove with Nero once you properly understand the timing of the exceeds mechanic. You'll probably never get to a point where you hit his exact timing 100% of the time, but you can absolutely get to a point where it's consistently happening more often than not. Alongside Red Queen, Nero has his gun, Blue Rose, and that's a much smaller departure from Dante's weapons here in the fourth game. Blue Rose can deal more damage than most of Dante's weapons with its charge shots, but its standard semi-automatic mode is largely still used as filler in the combo. The charge here in DMC4 is pretty slow, but level 3 does do significant damage for the first time since DMC1. Blue Rose will rarely be your main source of damage, but in a pinch, it can be useful to knock out enemies when you're forced to take a defensive posture. Its usefulness in Nero's kit, however, pales in comparison to his final major tool, the iconic Devil Bringer. The Devil Bringer is probably my favorite mechanic in the entire DMC series. Nero's demonic right arm is the perfect complement to his massive motorcycle sword, and provides a perfect piece of characterization for his playstyle. Where Dante and Vergil will always dodge around and kill their enemies with finesse, there's something to be said for the pure satisfaction that comes from just grabbing the fuckers and smashing them face down into the pavement. No enemy is impervious to it, and each of them has their own unique animations, including bosses. It's fucking awesome, and you simply are not immune to how cool it is. The Devilbringer also carries the Snatch ability, which is Nero's closer. Rather than using a teleport to follow enemies around the battlefield, he just yanks them right over with his spectral arm. It's a fantastic ability that makes it possible to stay airborne nearly perpetually if you can manage to jump cancel correctly. The arm itself is also just self-evidently badass. Perfect visual design in conjunction with fantastic mechanical utility. So if Nero is so awesome, why is it that players initially rejected him? Well, first of all, it's partially due to the identity grafting effect. Players had grown to identify with Dante a great deal, so it was always going to be a large hurdle to introduce a new protagonist to the series. A hurdle which was made almost insurmountable by the fact that Nero is both opposing the character that everyone knows and loves here in the fourth game, and is also kinda just a little bitch. In DMC4, Nero feels like the kid brother who everyone is excluding from the game because they think he's annoying. And when the characters you're already familiar with are treating him that way, you're going to follow suit. Despite there being numerous actual opportunities to fill Nero in on the situation, it doesn't actually occur until the torch has already been passed back to Dante. And so, for the majority of your time with him, Nero is just an angry, angsty teen wondering what the fuck is going on. He's not particularly three-dimensional here, and the disjointed narrative of DMC4 doesn't really help things. It's for these reasons that Nero isn't nearly as iconic as his father or his uncle, despite being just as much of a major player in the series. Turning to Dante, though, there's only one major update to his mode of gameplay, but it's a massive one. DMC4 shifts the style system so that now Dante can swap between them freely, just like he does with Devil Arms and Firearms. This change completes the shift of Dante's gameplay that was started in DMC3. It's with the introduction of style switching that the real anime shit becomes possible. I can't possibly execute those kinds of things here in the 4th game because my reaction time is just too slow, but it's absolutely possible to air juggle an enemy all the way from D to SSS by mixing Dante's styles, devil arms, and firearms properly. I can barely manage to jump cancel in the 4th game, but for those who can do these kinds of combos, DmC4's combat is still unmatched in the series. For my personal tastes, though, it's bordering on a bit too much to manage. Granted, I'm less experienced with Dante than I am with Nero, so part of that is just my lack of practice. But for some people, like myself, the number of variables you're managing with Dante is just a bit too overwhelming. I regularly forget which style I'm in, for example, and so Nero's style of gameplay with fewer variables and a greater emphasis on rhythm and timing is more appropriate to my way of thinking. In this way, the DmC series returns even closer to its fighting game roots. Just like one would do in a fighting game, DmC players from the 4th title onward often have a character that's their main, in a sense. One that they're more accustomed to and comfortable playing than the others. Sure, the basic mechanics underlying combat are the same no matter who you're playing as, but as I said earlier, each character is an instrument unto themselves. They all require very distinct forms of skill and muscle memory. This development of the gameplay is the greatest thing that DmC4 introduces to the series. Now, rather than simply grinding to get better with the relatively similar movesets of DmC3, Dante, and Vergil, characters feel very unique, and all have their own distinct style. You can tell Nero apart from Dante, apart from Lady, apart from Trish, apart from Vergil, apart from V, purely from how they move. If a black box was covering the character model and the sound was turned off, simply based on the way that box traverses the battlefield, you would be able to know which character was on screen. This new degree of self-expression in the combat is what makes DmC4 the title in the series to which the phrase gameplay is narrative applies the most. I'm going to be completely honest with you. I don't really care about the narrative of DmC4. Yes, it introduces Nero, which is a pivotal narrative function to the broader series, but the actual immediate plot of the game itself matters very little to me, and has very little consequence to any of the other titles before or after. What you're here to sink your teeth into is the gameplay on display, and to that end, little else actually matters. This is why, even though there are large swaths of DmC4 that feel incomplete, it's far from irredeemable. In all honesty, its biggest shortcomings are the fever dream level design and the constant reuse of assets. Had the devs spent just a little bit longer and actually finished the second half of the campaign, I think it would be remembered a lot more fondly than it is. As it was on release though, DmC4's quasi-finished state was rightfully considered to be a letdown. It didn't underperform commercially, but fan reception was not nearly as strong as it should have been, especially after a title with as much clout and strength as DmC3. It was enough of a reaction for the suits to feel like the series needed to be revitalized. Maybe that's true, but in all honesty, I don't think anyone was really asking for that. DmC3 was just reaching the pinnacle of its gameplay mechanics, and in retrospect, it's quite obvious that people wanted more of these mechanics just in a more complete product. Instead, the suits thought it was time to completely reboot DmC and reimagine the series' identity from square one. This would go down in history as one of the most ill-advised creative decisions in the franchise's lifetime, putting it on ice for 6 years. So while the next Devil May Cry game would release only a few years later in 2013, the next real installment in the franchise wouldn't release until 2019, all because of a completely unforced error. Coming into this video, DmC Devil May Cry was probably the game that I had the second most awareness of after DmC5. That awareness, however, was in no way first-hand, and was largely influenced by what seems to be the prevailing perception of the fanbase. DmC, which henceforth I'll be referring to as the reboot, is perceived as an overly edgy, absurdly cringe reboot with pretty good gameplay. While playing the game, I discovered that this sentiment was largely true. I also discovered something I didn't expect though, my biggest DmC dirty secret. The more I played the reboot, the more I realized I actually kind of love this game. I should clear up the fact that my love of the reboot is not entirely sincere. The perceptions of the game being ridiculously cringe are true. The second line of spoken dialogue in the game is,
The world is at last your bitch, as am I. Nothing left but to grab it by the hair, bend it over, and... What's the matter?
It was at this point that I knew I was in for some seriously primo cringe comedy. The game itself is so self-consciously edgy that it looks like it came out of Hot Topic. Dante and Vergil in this game act nothing like themselves. Actors straight up mispronounce the names of major characters like Mundus, which is pronounced in-game as Mundus. The thing is, though, I love cringe, and I love extremely self-conscious edge. In their own way, I think those things are hilarious and charming elements of the style of their time. I actually genuinely can't tell how much of the self-parody is intentional and how much of it is completely accidental. Am I meant to take the reboot at face value, or am I supposed to enjoy it, in part, as a highly stylized and largely unserious experience? That's the great thing about experiencing media rather than writing it yourself. I can choose to interpret and enjoy the reboot on whatever grounds I see fit, and I choose the grounds of self-parody. Throughout my experience with the reboot, there was one question continually echoing in my mind. Why was this game a DmC reboot to begin with? Sure, they use the character names and some series iconography, but the vast majority of this game is more of a twist on John Carpenter's They Live than Devil May Cry. In a world much like our own, Mundus, who is a different character from Mundus, controls the world from the shadows with a cabal of demons. They use subliminal messages in all of the media people consume, overt propaganda, and slurm soft drink to keep the populace submissive, subservient, and stupid. Meanwhile, Mundus and his friends siphon away their wealth and earthly pleasures while causing immense suffering at their discretion. I mean, if you change like 3 words in that synopsis and add in Rowdy Roddy Piper, boom, that's They Live. The plot has basically nothing to do with DmC lore as we know it. Neither, in fact, do Dante and Vergil. First of all, the two don't look anything like their usual selves, and are complete with Hot Topic redesigns that are largely black and gray with pops of their usual coloration. Oh, and of course, Vergil's trademark incel fedora. How do you do, m'lady? This already isn't a winning decision. Dante and Vergil are extremely iconic characters, and I mean that in the most literal sense possible. Dante and Vergil, on character design alone, are incredibly recognizable and aesthetically pleasing in their duality. The reboot largely homogenizes their look, and this was a bad call. They've also changed their origin story. The brothers are no longer half demon and half human, instead they're half demon and half angel, something which completely subverts the themes of the mainline series. In the mainline DmC games, a focus is placed on Dante's humanity as what makes him powerful. He has something the demons will never have, and that comes from something that's inside of every normal person. Now, the special destiny is fully affirmed, and Dante and Vergil's humanity is completely removed. Another bad decision. These characters are so unlike their original incarnations in every way that players don't even refer to them as Dante and Vergil. The fanbase has dubbed them, disaffectionately, Dante and Virgin. The reboot's fate was sealed the moment this clip from the opening sequence was shown for the first time.
Million years.
While in the context of the game, this line is actually ironic, it's the wrong way to introduce a reboot to one of the most popular and beloved game franchises of all time. In the reboot, Dante starts out missing his trademark white hairdo and instead has black hair. Over the course of the game, as Dante slowly discovers and accepts his demonic powers, his hair actually goes white, just like it always had been. In practice, this was meant to be a wry joke that was reneged on over the course of the narrative. When it appears in a brief demo, however, you don't have the context of the full game, and it instead comes across as pure contempt for your source material. It also didn't help that this new Dante is a lean, mean, demon-slaying machine who just learned the word fuck and really wants to use it, and definitely knows what sex is. We swear, guys, he's cooler this way. Dante in the reboot actually acts more like Nero than his old self. None of that is inherently bad. In fact, it's a big part of what makes me love the reboot in the cringy B-movie kind of way that I do love it. It is, however, wrong for DmC, and wrong for the character of Dante. Hence my question. If you didn't really want anything to do with the original characterizations of these characters, then why is it a Devil May Cry game? The best answer I can come up with is the mechanics. While the reboot bears basically no resemblance to the original series outside of some surface-level iconography, it actually does have a lot of the mechanical DNA of the earlier games in the series, and makes some interesting changes to the formula. While the combat system is by no means better than DMC5, I think the reboot actually has the second best game feel in the series, and incorporates a lot of Dante and Nero's gameplay mechanics into one cohesive whole. A cohesive whole that I just so happen to be using to kill Bill O'Reilly, Jeff Bezos, and the Slurm Queen. And you know what? I'm fucking here for it. In what might be something of a controversial design move, the reboot essentially gives Dante Nero's Devilbringer under a different name. Early on in the story, Dante gains access to a grappling whip called Ophion, which can be used to either pull objects and enemies toward Dante, or vice versa, depending on whether it's used in Angel Mode or Demon Mode, respectively. Angel Mode and Demon Mode are core to the reboot's combat system. They're states that are swapped between by holding either the left or right trigger, and give Dante access to different parts of his kit. The Ophion snatch moves take one of my favorite aspects of Nero's gameplay and staple it right onto Dante's with a slight twist. Where Nero's snatch decides to pull an enemy to the player or the player to an enemy based on that enemy's weight class, this new version for the reboot makes that movement a much more conscious choice. You have to judge which mode of Ophion to use based on the enemy spacing of the combat encounter, where you are in that encounter, and what kind of combo you're trying to pull off. Does this make combat easier? Perhaps yes, but the system has its own risks associated with it. Make the wrong move, and you'll absolutely botch your combo by pulling yourself into an attack, or by trying to pull in an enemy that's immune. Just like moving the wrong way with Trickster will get you clapped, using the wrong mode of Ophion will do the same. Where DMC4 had Dante style switching and hot swapping between multiple weapons and guns during every combat encounter, the reboot streamlines that hot swapping a great deal. Rather than each Devil Arm being its own unique weapon, they're all absorbed into Rebellion as an alternate form that can be accessed on the fly by using either Angel Mode or Demon Mode. Because of Dante's Nephilim heritage, he has demonic weapons bound to one trigger and angelic weapons bound to the other, each serving distinct purposes. Where the demonic suite of Arbiter and Eryx focus on slower, more powerful single-target attacks, and the angelic suite of Osiris and Aquila focuses more on speed and crowd control. I thought I wasn't going to like this twist on DMC's combat system at first, but it actually grew on me far more than I ever expected it would. The Angel Mode, Demon Mode, Neutral Mode layout makes it much easier to hot swap between weapons, because rather than having to remember where you are in your loadout or being limited by what comes next, you're able to much more freely mix and match whatever combination of moves you please. Similarly, your movement options, like the Angel Dash, are tied to Angel Mode and Demon Mode, so the change essentially rolls style switching and weapon swapping into one singular variable. I'm sure that some purists would be mad about this seeming reduction of difficulty in combat, but I'm never going to complain about it. Especially as someone who struggles with hot swapping Devil Arms and styles, this system is a lot more fluid and allows for way more combo possibilities without feeling like you're ever going to break your hands. You'll never have to make the dreaded double swap to pull off a combo, because you'll always have the next arm you need hotkeyed to either the left trigger or right trigger. You'll never have to claw grip the controller in order to access a movement option either, because again, they'll always be bound to the left or right trigger. Sometimes you might want to single swap using the D-pad, as you can only have one Angel Arm and one Devil Arm equipped at a time, but generally speaking, the system is far, far more fluid than any other version of Dante in the series. It's also core to what made DMC great to begin with. DMC has always been, in large part, based on a simplification of fighting game formulas. DMC combos are so fun to string together because the inputs themselves are never actually that complicated. It's knowing what those inputs do to your movement that matters the most. When the combat begins to juggle too many variables, I think it starts to drive DMC away from what made it so fun in the first place, and the reboot actually brings that beautiful simplicity back to the combat system in a surprisingly big way. My enjoyment of the system grew to the point that I kind of wish they had stolen this Devil Arm hotkey system for DMC5 Dante, but I understand why they didn't. After the amount of backlash that this portrayal of the world and characters had received, DMC5 was basically incapable of taking any design cues from the reboot without risking a major blowout from fans. If Dante had returned to his old self, but using the control scheme from the reboot, I don't even want to think about how many death threats would have been sent to Capcom offices. The reboot system does also de-emphasize firearms more than pretty much any other DMC game. You have only Ebony and Ivory and the shotgun, with a late-game quasi-grenade launcher during the final missions. Firearms haven't been the main focus of DMC combat since the first game, but their use is still integral to DMC 3 and 4. In the reboot, you could probably get away with barely ever firing a gun, which is okay because the sword combat does feel that good, but firearms have always been core to Dante as part of his aesthetic, so even if they aren't the main source of damage, they're still pretty important to the style of classic DMC combat. There is one thing about the reboot's combat system that I really don't like though. It eliminates lock-on. In order to make space for the game's dodge buttons, left and right bumper, the ability to lock on has been removed. This is a subtle change to the system, but it has some pretty severe ramifications, not the least of which being, you can't really single out a specific enemy anymore. The game even has enemy types like the Harpies that would directly incentivize a lock-on feature, but it's been removed from the controller altogether. Dante's automatic targeting isn't terrible by any means, but it's not perfect. And there were plenty of times I wanted to be singling out a specific enemy but couldn't. The removal of lock-on also creates problems for accessing certain parts of the moveset. For example, in the classic DMC style, lock-on is used to access just about every single move that causes the player character to move through space. It's not universally true, but the vast majority of them do this. Stinger, High Time, Caliber, Rapid Slash, they all require you to lock on in order to use their functionality. Stinger and many similar moves have been ported into Dante's moveset in the reboot, but without lock-on, accessing them has become very awkward. Rather than simply inputting lock-on, directional, and triangle, instead a double directional on the analog stick is required. Unlike most of the other changes made to the combat, this one overcomplicates something that was simple to begin with. It made it so that I was basically never using Stinger, one of Dante's most iconic moves, because it was just too awkward on the controller. Even from an aesthetic perspective, though, the reboot is actually quite fun. I really like a lot of the more absurdist level design within Limbo. They'll take these mundane, industrial, or bureaucratic environments and turn them into sort of nightmare versions of themselves. One of my favorite examples of this was the Slurm Factory. Dante and Kat, his new witch sidekick for this game, run into this warehouse, and she says something along the lines of, "I remember it being a lot bigger than this," only for Dante to fall hundreds of feet down a massive shaft on entering Limbo, and realizing that this is the real warehouse. The levels are all like this, really fun and interesting transformations of mundane locations. I love urban fantasy, the idea that just beyond our normal perception is a world of magic and wonder or horror, depending on your story. And these Limbo levels scratch that itch perfectly. The Bill O fight stands out on this front too, turning a propagandistic TV station into a massive underground panopticon, with the boss fight taking place inside the TV world. There's no big Bill O monster, he's just a literal giant talking head inside the TV. It's fucking awesome punk rock shit. There are even cutaways within the Bullet Hell boss fight, where you have to battle groups of enemies within a TV frame while Bill manufactures consent towards the rebellion. Even with the great aesthetic stuff though, the game just can't ever fully outrun its own script. Through dialogue alone, the reboot completely eschews any possibility of being taken seriously. This clip has made the rounds on the internet before, but it did so because it's exemplary of how bad the dialogue in this reboot really is.
So you must be the secret ingredient.
Who are you?
I'm your prom date, you ugly sack of shit. You missed it. My name, by the way, is Dante.
Dante, son of Spada and Eva, the
Yeah, but you can call me Dante the Demon Killer. Has a nice ring to it, don't you think?
You want to kill me? You can't kill me. I'm 1,200 years old.
You don't look a day over 12,000.
Fuck you!
Fuck you!
Fuck you!
It's that Hot Topic brand of edge that I personally can enjoy a lot for an ironic laugh, while still knowing that my ironic laugh was not the intended reaction. The earlier DMC games are full of hilarious and absurd moments, but they're absolutely intentional camp. The things I laugh at in the reboot are not camp, they're cringe, two concepts which I think are deeply related, but have one major differentiating factor. Camp is intentional, cringe is not. The reboot on every aesthetic level reads as though the developers sincerely believed they had sanded the camp out of DMC and created a more gritty and grounded version of the series. There are definitely moments that are meant to be funny, and the fuck you battle does seem like it could be one of them, but the rest of the game takes itself seriously, even when very little about it reads that way. They don't play the funny stuff absurdly enough for it to read as meaningfully distinct from what's supposed to be sincere, and that's what creates a confusing and jarring tone that's just full to the brim with cringe. The story in this reboot also throws away a lot of the personal stakes. Dante and Vergil are working together for the vast majority of this narrative to depose Mundus and save the world, TM. This is a fundamental misunderstanding of what makes the narrative of the Sons of Sparta arc enjoyable. Yes, Dante does frequently save the world, but it's never really his objective. It's always more personal. This narrative of the Vergil heel turn is trying to give Vergil a more realistic motivation for his antagonistic posture, but actually, ironically, it makes everything far more cookie-cutter than it ever was in the main series by just conforming to a Hollywood trope. It also makes next to no sense. Vergil never really seems to display the paternalistic mentality he takes on immediately after the defeat of Mundus throughout the course of the game, and so this heel turn feels like a complete character 180 rather than a believable villain motivation. It's for reasons like this that the DMC reboot was never going to work. While yes, Ninja Theory's gameplay is excellent and there's plenty you can enjoy here if you like cringy edge, they fundamentally misunderstood the appeal of the DMC series. A gritty, edgy, and more realistic reboot was never going to resonate with the fanbase because DMC has never been gritty nor edgy. Just because there's demons involved in your story doesn't mean it has to be dark and edgy. DMC had never once even approached this tonality while it was building its fanbase, and thus a pivot to that direction for the series was sure to alienate all the fans who made the series what it was in the first place. You're right, this sure ain't your daddy's Devil May Cry. And I liked his better. Before we got that, though, there was one piece of DLC for the reboot that is, unfortunately, not an improvement. In fact, I think it's what made sure that this version of the DMC continuity, for better or for worse, would never be revisited. Vergil's Downfall was released shortly after the main campaign and seems to have been an attempt to bridge the gap between the reboot and a potential sequel. The DLC is just bizarre, and you really have to play it to understand what I mean. Interestingly enough, though, out of all the games in the DMC series that have Vergil campaigns, this DLC is the only one that honestly and genuinely produces new narrative content, specifically from Vergil's perspective. Sure, that content sucks ass, but it was worth a shot. The reboot's gameplay, at least, does hold up in the DLC, and for what it's worth, I think that for the most part they adapt Vergil's mechanics into the reboot's combat systems in a way that makes sense and feels pretty good. Judgment cuts, trick teleporting, all of that actually feels great in context of the reboot's combat systems. And while Vergil only ever uses the Yamato, his angel and demon attacks are all satisfying enough and flow into each other very well. The one mechanic that doesn't really translate is Vergil's summon swords, and the saddest thing is, it could be fixed with some very small tweaks. The swords themselves work the same as they always have, they're just floaty and way too slow. In the earlier games, Vergil's summon swords move around the same pace as a bullet. Here in the reboot, they move at what feels like half speed, and the lack of any kind of lock-on basically makes them completely useless. The summon swords are one of Vergil's most iconic character flourishes, and they've been rendered completely unusable by the reboot's mechanics. Then of course we turn to the real elephant in the room with Vergil's downfall. The narrative. This is where the issues with the reboot go from being enjoyably stupid to unbearably cringe. Here's the thing. To an extent, the cringe of the reboot worked during the main campaign, because Dante as the protagonist is, inherently, a semi-unserious character. There's always an undercurrent of Dante being the funny man, even in this overly self-serious reboot, that allows the cringe to land as comedy even when it's not intentional. In Vergil's downfall, that luxury is no longer available to the game. This instead is Vergil's very weighty and deathly serious villain origin story, one which is handled with very little skill or attention to Vergil's character. For starters, I'm not even sure exactly what's happening in this DLC. Vergil seems to be confronting some sort of inner demon-type character after his battle with Dante, and that is what's driving him into evil? I'm really not sure on the whole thing. The cutscenes are all delivered in a comic book style that's actually somewhat reminiscent of the Infamous games. What exactly is happening, though, isn't entirely clear because I genuinely can't tell what's real here and what's not. There's no stylistic delineation between the things that are real and the things that are part of Vergil's hallucinations. If I can't tell what's real to the narrative, then how is it supposed to impact me? Sure, blurring the lines between fantasy and reality works great for people like David Lynch, but this ain't fucking Firewalk with me. It's the cringe DmC reboot. Suffice it to say, this team does not exactly excel at writing ambiguity, and that lack of ability to write ambiguity comes across most in the way they portray Vergil's character. Sure, Vergil in DmC 3 wasn't the most nuanced character in history, but he was a lot more so than Virgin here. This DLC exists primarily to justify Vergil's heel turn at the end of the main campaign. Vergil in the main campaign, for all intents and purposes, seemed to be a well-intentioned freedom fighter, until literally the second last cutscene of the game, at which point he abruptly pivoted to wanting to rule over humanity in the wake of Mundus. Never mind the fact that this makes no sense for Vergil as he was shown in previous iterations, there's literally no indication of this darker side of his character in this iteration. This DLC seems to be under the impression that the Vergil of the reboot is in fact a complete fucking psychopath. Over the course of a measly 2-hour expansion, Vergil goes from a highly composed genius tactician who had ambitions of paternalistically ruling the world, to a gibbering homicidal maniac that wants to, or maybe does, kill his own mother. There's just nothing about this that works. The performance is hammy, the writing is sloppy, and it makes a character who had some possibility of working absolutely insufferable for no good reason. This isn't just any character, either. This is the guy who was supposed to be the main antagonist of the new rebooted series. With this being the connective bridge between the first game and subsequent titles, any possibility of the reboot being continued was dead on arrival. Despite what this DLC seems to be trying to do, Vergil is now far more of a cartoon character than he ever was in the original series. Before, Vergil was a callous utilitarian in search of power at any cost, but he wasn't a fucking cackling psychotic mob murderer. He's a far more nuanced character in Devil May Cry 3 than he ever is in this reboot or its DLC. Even in Devil May Cry 5, where he commits what are probably his most evil actions in the series to date, you get the sense that if he was acting fully within his right mind, the whole Clifot thing probably wouldn't have happened. It's far too inelegant of a solution for Vergil. The Virgin presented here in the DLC doesn't even have the presence of mind left to pull off a plan like Vergil does in the main series. It's not even cringe anymore, it just sucks. Now, you might be saying, Andy, this isn't the same Vergil, though. He's a different character, so they treat him differently. I'd like to address this critique on two levels. First of all, the obvious. Yes, it's a different character, but that doesn't stop this from being a far worse and less viable direction for the franchise. Second of all, if this version of Vergil isn't meant to, on some level, recall the Vergil we all know and love from DmC 3, then why is he Vergil at all? It's quite obvious that he's supposed to be at least some kind of analog to the Vergil of the original series, right down to his moveset. He has all the same summon sword moves, many of his attacks with Yamato recall his moveset from DmC 3, and he even keeps parts of Vergil's Dark Slayer style from the original appearance. So clearly, this Vergil is supposed to be some kind of depiction of that character, even if his life circumstances are somewhat different. Characterization in DMC is often related to combat, and Vergil's style is all about elegance and precision. Why would the team still be using these movesets if they didn't intend for elegance and precision to remain part of Vergil's characterization? The answer is because it's sloppy and lazy. Yeah, the combat still feels good, but no attention has been paid to make sure that it reflects the character in the way that all the other entries in the DMC series have done so effortlessly. It's worth noting as well that while I praised the reboot's streamlined method of weapon swapping, the same mechanic is used here in the DLC to homogenize gameplay across characters in a way that the original series would never have allowed. In my chapter on DMC4, I talked about how each character in that game is an instrument unto themselves. Vergil's moveset does differ from Dante's in the reboot, at the very least in their basic weapons, but there aren't really any aspects of gameplay that are unique to Vergil. Perhaps the closest you get is the Doppelganger Devil Trigger, but that mode is actually pretty rare in the gameplay loop. Devil Trigger in the reboot is a mechanic that you use far less frequently than in the mainline series. In the main series, you probably activate Devil Trigger once or twice in every combat encounter. The reboot makes it something that appears more like every 3 or 4 encounters, and so Vergil's Doppelganger doesn't really feel like a core part of his playstyle. The combat doesn't feel bad by any stretch of the imagination, but there is a feeling that something has been lost here in the homogenization of gameplay across characters. It suggests to me that had the reboot series continued, there would be very little development of that characterization through gameplay that comes with a character action series. Vergil's downfall is, in all reality, a pretty obviously half-baked DLC. It's functional, but it's far from being genuinely effective in a way that would have made people interested in more of this rebooted DMC continuity. It falls flat, and I think the developers at Capcom knew it, because this was the end of the line for Ninja Theory's DMC. Capcom has said that this reboot universe isn't completely dead, but at this point it seems like anyone who argues that seriously is fooling themselves. It's the verbiage of people who don't want to contradict themselves on the off chance that they do bring the reboot continuity back, but don't seriously expect to do so. The DMC reboot is incredibly unlikely to become a series, which is all the better because it's a reboot that no one really asked for in the first place. DMC4 was never horrible, it just wasn't really finished. No one but Capcom suits looking at pie charts of demographics and market shares thought that the DMC series had exhausted its potential, and to their credit, after the reboot's release, Capcom seems to have realized this and corrected for that mistake. They reneged and brought the main continuity back, and it was a glorious return indeed. After the reboot's mixed reception, the DMC series sort of went into hiding for the next 6 years or so. From 2013 to 2018, there was nary a word about the DMC series. If you don't count the reboot, there hadn't been a mainline DMC game in 10 years since DMC4 was released in 2008. It seemed to many people like it may have been gone forever. So considering that, it makes a lot of sense that this was the fan reaction when DMC5 was finally revealed at E3 2018. DMC5 is about as close as you can come to making a perfect game. A fact made even more astounding when you realize that it's only the second game in the series that actually feels like it's a fully realized and complete project. And it only took what was basically a double console generation leap to make it happen. The difference between DMC4 and 5 visually is drastic. In another note that proves DMC and Resident Evil are forever inextricably linked, DMC5 uses the RE engine, developed for the revival of the Resident Evil series in RE7. It really brings into stark relief just how big that decade-long gap between DMC4 and 5 was, or even the 6-year gap between the reboot and the 5th mainline game. The visual leap between the 7th and 8th console generations was staggering, and DMC benefits from that just as much as Resident Evil did. The ways in which it benefits are completely different, though. In horror gaming, visual fidelity has a direct effect on the ways in which the developer can create scares. The hallways full of bugs in the old house on the Baker estate wouldn't be nearly as terrifying if those bugs were rendered the same way they would have been back in the late 90s. DmC5, while not strictly needing the visual upgrades to improve the gameplay experience, benefits a great deal from the extreme degree of polish that the RE engine can present. In a game that's all about looking and feeling cool, the higher the quality of the visuals, the more that feeling is going to come across. DmC4 managed to get to a pretty good place with its art style and the graphical fidelity of the 7th console generation, but once you've booted up DmC5, there's just no comparison. Watch the opening cutscene of Nero spinning through the air gunning down a horde of lesser Impusa in slow motion, and you'll never be able to go back. Even when I hadn't even played a DmC game before, it had me going, "Fuck yeah, Devil May Cry's back, baby!" It really is hard to overstate just how much of a triumph of action game design DmC5 is. It's also kind of hard to explain, but I'm going to do my best to do so anyway. I mentioned in my chapter on that game that while DmC4 perfected much of the series' combat systems, the pacing and feeling of combat in that game is just slightly off for my taste. DmC5 reaches what I think is the most perfect combat feel of any of the games thus far. Now granted, I'm deeply biased here. I learned with DmC5, so that combat feel is ingrained in my bones in a way that none of the other games really is. That said, there's something about the pacing of DmC5's combat that is just absolutely perfect to me. It's like the developers took the combat systems from DmC4, updated the graphics and UI, and tweaked all of the timing variables just the slightest bit so that the reaction timing is a bit more forgiving, but combat doesn't feel painfully slow. It's the exact right pacing for my brain. The characters' attacks all feel distinct and have the perfect amount of impact behind them. Jump canceling is manageable, but not so easy that you'll be able to pull it off without trying. It also has far more noticeable visual feedback than previous titles. In DmC 3 and 4, I often struggle to tell when I've successfully cancelled a move. In DmC 5, I never experienced that level of ambiguity due to the clear auditory and visual feedback that comes along with a jump cancel. DmC 5's launches feel better too. The launches of the 4th game have a certain floatiness to them that 5 largely eliminates. Skills like High Roller and High Time now tee you up perfectly for follow-up strikes and jump cancels, where in 4 the enemy would land slightly higher in the air than you, and you'd have to wait a moment for them to fall into your path. Melee-focused characters are much easier to get started with here, because of the ease with which jump canceling comes. From what I can tell, some fans of the series do bemoan this. There's always going to be a certain population of people who will view any level of streamlining or clarification of mechanics as dumbing down the game for the casuals. I don't think that segment of the population is particularly large with DmC5, but it definitely does exist as an undercurrent in the fanbase. Even with the increased ease of jump cancels and the readjusted combat pacing, DmC5 has by far the most depth in its combat systems out of any title in the series. Each of its 4 characters has so many different mechanics that with over 150 hours in the game, I'm still learning new things about them to this day. There's so much here that I don't think any one person could ever keep track of and make effective use of all of them. Why then are there so many mechanics? The answer's pretty simple. More mechanics means more opportunities for personal expression in your style. Sure, you might not have been making constant use of Devil Sword Dante's summon swords outside of Swordmaster or Devil Trigger, but they are there, and players who like the feel of them will incorporate those into their style. I've watched a good amount of DmC5 gameplay, and no 2 players' styles look exactly alike, even with the characters who have smaller skill pools. The smallest and strangest of those skill pools is DmC5's newest comer, V. Like Lady before him in DmC4 Special Edition, V is DmC5's resident weirdo. Unlike Lady, though, he functions in a way that's almost completely alien to the combat systems of the series thus far, and because of that is somewhat controversial in the fanbase. V is a summoner. Instead of fighting directly, he has 3 demonic pets, Shadow, Griffin, and Nightmare, that do his dirty work for him. Fans who've been there since the first entry will realize that V's pets are actually all bosses from DmC1, and their movesets are direct adaptations of those boss kits. There are narrative reasons for this that are pretty obvious when you consider that only one major famous character in DMC has a V in his name, but for now we'll focus purely on their gameplay utility, and how it fundamentally changes the way you play V when compared to other characters that are more conventional. Combat with V is inherently impersonal in a way that no other DMC character is. With most DMC characters, they're the direct focus of the combat encounter, and they're dealing the damage directly. Even with Lady, who's largely focused on ranged combat, there's still more of a sense that she's directly involved in the fray than V is. Each of V's pets is partially AI controlled and partially directly controlled. You can't really direct the way that Griffin or Shadow move around the battlefield, but you can choose which enemies they attack and what moves they use. Therefore, combat with V becomes a twofold challenge. Firstly, deal damage and vary your strikes enough that your style gauge continues to rise, and secondly, move V around the battlefield, managing spacing and dodging enemies effectively enough that he doesn't get hit. The idea behind V isn't fundamentally flawed, and the rhythm of his gameplay is actually a really fun twist on the way you interact with DMC's combat. Your relationship to the jump cancel is almost completely inverted when you interact with V. Where most characters use it as a way to extend and complicate combos, Enemy Step becomes a Mario-esque defensive maneuver when fighting with V. A Hellcaina will swing its scythe at you, and in response you will jump on its head just like a Goomba in order to avoid the strike and land behind him, comfortably out of range. When you're playing V well, there's a sense of the cool guys don't look at explosions mentality that comes in. Shadow and Griffin tear up the battlefield, and all the while, enemies are trying desperately to land a hit, while V just has his nose buried in William Blake, finishing off enemies and building up Devil Trigger until he can summon Nightmare to close out the encounter. That's the intended play pattern with V. The issue comes in with the numbers. Shadow and Griffin, flat out, just don't do enough damage with most of their attacks, especially on higher difficulties. The spongier the enemies become, the less viable most of V's attacks are, to the point that most of the highest difficulties will just be spamming Shadow and Griffin's charge attacks until Nightmare is ready to go and deal all the real damage. Unfortunately, it becomes way too repetitive. When roughly 80% of your moves become obsolete, the core of what makes DMC combat great gets lost. DMC lives and dies by the creative expression that can be found in its combat systems, and I think this is exactly why V is something of a controversial character. This isn't to say that he should have been excluded from the roster, but rather that some simple tweaks to the numbers and a few additional skills could have made the experience of playing him far more dynamic and interesting than it actually is in the final product. Dante remains much the same as he was in DMC4, at least on the fundamental level. Dante naturally plays a bit different with each title because his devil arms necessitate a certain degree of variation, but the 5th game's roster is made up of largely variations on prior themes, with only one genuinely new weapon. This is certainly the arsenal that I'm most comfortable with as far as Dante is concerned, and it features some of my favorite weapons in the entire series. Devil Sword Dante is by far my favorite of the Devil Swords, largely because of how it handles the Swordmaster moveset of Rebellion. In prior titles, Rebellion only had access to Aerial Rave when Dante was in the Swordmaster style. It was bound to the style button, which made accessing aerial combos a little bit clunkier. Devil Sword Dante has completely different functions in Swordmaster because of its summon swords, but nothing is lost in this edition. Most of Rebellion's Swordmaster moves are folded into the basic kit of Devil Sword Dante in some pretty masterful ways. The only iconic move that didn't make it into the DSD kit was Round Trip, but even then there's a Summon Sword analog. None of the additional moves are excessively complicated either, which is pretty shocking considering that the developers had to rebind 5 moves into an already full moveset. All this to say that the incorporation of Aerial Rave into Devil Sword Dante's moveset as the basic aerial combo makes air juggling far more fluid, and causes it to require fewer style switches, which is always going to be a win in my book. King Cerberus, similarly, is a variation on a fan favorite from DMC3, but it's so much more than the original form. While playing with Cerberus in DMC3, I always felt its moveset to be a bit anemic. That's largely because King Cerberus just packs so much utility into one weapon. It's not just the added utility, though. King Cerberus is faster, its revolvers feel incredible, and make for excellent jump cancel fodder. It's as though this weapon feels like what Cerberus in DMC3 was always supposed to be, made possible by the advancements in physics, graphical fidelity, and the simple gameplay of the series that occurred between the PS2 era and the end of the PS4 era. Many of the devil arms in DMC5 feel as though they're full realizations of what the development teams wanted to do with some of the more iconic weapons in previous entries. The only one that feels completely unique is Cavalier, Dante's very own, far more literal motorcycle sword. It's an absurd weapon, just completely ridiculous. But as has been a common theme in this video, absurdity serves DMC quite well. There's nothing better than punching or kicking a group of enemies with Balrog and then riding them down with a literal motorcycle out of nowhere. Every piece of Dante's kit in DMC5 feels excellent. I just have one problem with the whole thing, that being that there's just a bit too much going on here. With each successive title after DMC3 where hot swapping was introduced, Dante has been asked to juggle an additional weapon and an additional firearm. By the time you get to DMC5, he's wielding at least 4 devil arms and at least 5 firearms at once, and for me that's officially too many. Yeah, you can remove devil arms and firearms from his loadout, but you're really not playing in the full spirit of the character when you do, and his style ranking is designed with the 4 devil arm approach in mind. It's officially too much to keep track of. I'll admit that over time I've gotten much better at keeping everything straight with some practice, but between style switching, firearm switching, devil arm switching, and the actual manipulation of the character in space, there's just so much shit going on and something's gotta give. For me, it's always the styles or the firearms. I can never for the life of me remember both which style I'm in and which gun I have active. My brain just doesn't have enough RAM for it, and thus Dante is relegated away from main status for me. Just as I likened Nero to playing the bass guitar, playing Dante in DMC5 is like playing lead guitar. Really fucking complicated, really cool if you can actually shred, and really easy to play in such a way that everyone at the party wants you to stop. Speaking of Nero though, he's the final piece that rounds out DMC5's original roster, and he's just so good. Once again, I'm deeply biased here, but to my mind, it's unbelievable just how much Nero feels like a perfect evolution of the character presented in DMC4. His basic mechanics are all the same, but there are some slight new additions to his kit that really round out his combat verbs in a way that feels like they always should have been there in the first place. I'm not even talking about his new devil trigger that you gain access to at the end of the game. I'm talking specifically about the moves Payline and Hardway, and the addition of the Devil Breakers. Payline and Hardway are 2 new moves to Red Queen, and they're the only 2 that are added, but together they provide Nero with something he was in desperate need of: more movement options. Nero in DMC4 could only actually move laterally with 2 of his moves, Caliber and Streak. Those moves are fantastic and still useful, but Payline and Hardway are natural and elegant additions to that kit. Payline's ability to drive Nero downward at an angle allows him to cross the battlefield in a single strike, and feels perfectly at home with the rest of his reckless and momentum-driven kit. Hardway functions similarly, allowing Nero to leap after a previous strike and follow up with a downward slash by simply holding and releasing triangle. Capcom really nailed this one. I mentioned in my chapter on DMC4 that Nero feels more like his attacks are dictated by the weight of his sword, and not the other way around. The animation for Hardway feels like he's just flinging his sword with all his might, and his body is coming along for the ride. These ground slamming moves also serve a key function in Nero's combat loop by interacting with the exceeds mechanic. When the sword has a static and direct point of impact, the ground in this case, it becomes much easier to consistently execute exceeds on them. If you fall out of rhythm in your combos, Payline and Hardway are useful ways to essentially reset your rhythm by using a more objective baseline. When he hits the ground, you hit the left trigger and your exceeds are now back on track. You could do this in DMC4 with Split, but that attack only moved directly downward, and thus was not guaranteed to be useful in a combo 100% of the time. Payline and Hardway provide options that make contact with the ground, but allow lateral movement both in the air and on the ground. And with each of these new moves, Nero's kit feels complete in a way that I really missed playing DMC4. Then there's the Devil Breakers, and with them comes an interesting fact about DMC5 that I haven't really heard discussed. In the opening of the 5th game, Nero's Devilbringer is brutally and abruptly ripped off by an unknown assailant. From this point on, literally until the final boss fight, Nero's down an arm and has to rely on a series of robotic arms created by his mechanic, Nico. This makes Nero in DMC5 the first disabled DMC protagonist. He's far from the only character in an action game to struggle with disability, but I think DMC5 actually handles it better than most action games do when they use this disabled warrior archetype. Now, obviously I'm not a disabled person, so if you, the viewer, are, and have thoughts about my analysis here, I'd love to hear them in the comments. But I'm going to try to explain why I think Nero's position here in DMC5 is actually pretty good disability representation, even if it's not perfect. Take Sekiro, for example. That game features a protagonist who uses a prosthetic arm as well, but in the reality of the game, the character's disability has no effect on his combat effectiveness. In fact, Wolf's prosthetic actually gives him back everything his arm could and more. Most sources I've seen would consider this to be weak disability representation, because the character's disability has been completely negated by technology, and really doesn't factor into his character at all. In contrast, Nero was a demigod to begin with, so his version of disability is not quite as difficult as real people's are, but DMC5 does portray his struggling with the loss of the supernatural limb that ostensibly made him powerful. He feels inadequate. Dante even calls him dead weight, something that's become a meme in the community, but in the context of the game, is Dante calling his own nephew an ableist slur in a heated and emotionally charged moment. The game's representation of disability actually becomes ludonarrative through the Devil Breakers. Just like a normal human's prosthetic limb would serve some of the functions of a biological limb, but at this point in time can't fully replace it, the Devil Breakers do the same for Nero. Yes, he has full range of motion, but the utilities that the Devilbringer brought in combat are lost for the most part. Snatch is replaced by Wire Snatch, but Buster, Hold, and Devil Trigger are completely gone, with only one breaker able to restore one of those abilities. The breakers are also fragile, shattering completely if you should get hit while using one of their abilities, a significant downside that the Devilbringer didn't have. There are real mechanical consequences that come along with the loss of Nero's arm, and yet he overcomes those limitations and basically solves the Red Grave Crisis almost by himself. At the same time, those unique abilities add a massive amount of depth to the combat, allowing you to mix and match Nero's many prostheses in a magazine. There are 8 different Devil Breakers, each one with its own unique ability. You feel the loss of Nero's Devilbringer's many utilities, but still have creative freedom to play around with the different Devil Breakers' powers. No two people are going to stack their Devil Breaker magazine the same way, and for the most part, the arms are actually all pretty balanced. There are a couple that are noticeably more powerful than the rest, Buster Arm and Ragtime being particular standouts and mainstays of my kit. You might use 8 of the same Devil Breaker for consistency, or any number of different permutations. You can't switch between them without destroying the one that's currently equipped, so the order you put them in matters and changes how you play. Some combos rely directly on Devil Breakers being placed in a specific order, and using well-timed breakaways to switch and continue the attack. It's really an incredible system, and I hope it returns in a DMC 6. The one issue with Nero's representation of disability in the game is the fact that it plays into the magical healing trope. When Nero gains access to his Devil Trigger, his arm regenerates, which I really don't think should have happened. It doesn't even serve as the Devilbringer anymore. The Devilbringer returns, but as a completely spectral arm that doesn't manifest all the time on Nero's human form. I mean, hell, the game even has to clunkily write around this reintegration of Nero's limb by adding Devil Breakers that are compatible with his regenerated arm. If the Devilbringer was going to come back, Nero should have retained his physical disability rather than getting the arm back. It's one point against what I think is overall pretty solid disability representation. Again though, people with actual disabilities, please feel free to speak up in the comments if you think I'm being stupid here. I only have the lens that I have, but I also don't want to completely avoid talking about things like this because I may get some things wrong. I'd be happy to hear what people think. All of this brings to mind the other greatest aspect of DMC5. While its gameplay is incredible, it's the first title in the series since DMC3 that actually presents strong and interesting thematic content. DMC4, from a narrative standpoint, wasn't completely finished, and we've exhaustively covered my feelings toward the reboot's narrative. DMC5, though, actually engages with some pretty heavy stuff, and the themes surrounding disability aren't the full extent of that. At its core, DMC5 is actually a story about toxic masculinity, told through the mythical framework that was established in DMC3, which, I'm gonna be honest, is not something I ever would have expected the series to comment on. The rivalry between Dante and Vergil has been a driving force of the series since the latter character was introduced, and DMC5 finally delves into the core of why that exists and how it ends. Dante and Vergil, since they were children, have never been able to simply admit the one thing they always wanted to but can't seem to express. That being that after everything, from their childhood rivalry to the feud in DMC 3 to the near-apocalyptic events of DMC 5, the two of them do love each other. Vergil, of course, is the most explicit expression of this, his insatiable obsession with power personified in his demonic half, Urizen. Vergil's toxic obsession with violence and physical power is so great that when separated from his humanity, it becomes a demon lord so powerful that it kills what totals to probably double-digit thousands of people in the Red Grave incident. Men's obsession with power and violence has been responsible for arguably the vast majority of unnecessary human death since time immemorial, and Urizen and his Qliphoth tree are a personification of that fact. It's notably only when Vergil has been separated from his constant need for violent power that he can work alongside Dante. V isn't just Vergil's humanity, he's Vergil's physical and emotional vulnerability. V literally has to rely on others to make it through his levels. He's the definition of vulnerability and the antithesis of the toxic masculine ideal. Learned, wayfish, soft-spoken, deeply conscientious, and even sentimental. V is the first person to directly open up about anything in his conversation with Trish, essentially directly stating the feelings that Vergil as a fully formed man is too proud to. This splitting of Vergil also performs a key role in somewhat laundering his actions as Urizen in the story. Vergil separating his demonic and human halves was necessary for him to heal from his time in service of Mundus, and erecting the Qliphoth was never his intention. This is key to note because the actions of Urizen are responsible for an incalculable amount of death and destruction siphoning human blood to feed the Qliphoth. Vergil's actions are responsible for the problem being created, but he, as a person, did not intend or expect this degree of indiscriminate violence. He's guilty, but not to the extent that you no longer empathize with him as a character. If that were the case, you wouldn't be able to root for him and Dante to bury the hatchet in the way that they do at the end of the story, despite Dante's own best efforts. Dante is far from exempt in he and Vergil's toxic dynamic. The moment V merges with Urizen, Dante's immediate assumption is that he has to murder his brother. There isn't even a moment of deliberation or consideration of an alternative. He also displays his own toxic obsession with power and how he treats Nero. No matter how capable Nero demonstrates himself to be, Dante won't listen to him and treats him like a child. Dante, just like Vergil, is too proud to accept help or listen to others. Everything is a competition to him, and as we discussed all the way back in DMC 1, his stylish attitude is simply another way of pushing out any emotional vulnerability that he might have. Vergil embraces cold, emotionless power, but Dante, for all his talk of accepting his humanity and his emotions, veils all sincerity through sarcasm, and settles pretty much every conflict at the point of a gun. Even though he works alongside a literal example of demonic redemption in Trish, he refuses to extend that belief and hope to his own brother. Only Nero, the son of Vergil, is capable of righting the wrongs between the two brothers, the new generation superseding the mistakes of the previous. He discovers that through the truest connection to his humanity that any of the Sparta clan have ever really experienced. For all intents and purposes, Nero has lost all connection to his demonic power for most of the story. He has to solve the Red Grave incident almost completely alone, and is the first to strike Urizen as an admittedly physically superior human. Through the incident, Nero has to learn to overcome his anger, and really grows up as a character in a way that Dante or Vergil never really has. It's actually a really touching story that's supported by the DMC series' best trait, its gameplay. DMC 5 manages to strike the tonal balance that the best of its predecessors did, the one that made the series famous in the first place, and does so with some legitimately interesting and moving thematic material. It compromises on nothing in terms of the usual insanity and goofiness of the franchise, without losing any of the seriousness or heart. Yes, this is the game where Dante does a Michael Jackson-style dance when he gets his magic hat that shoots demon blood. And it's also a legitimately great story about overcoming toxic masculinity and intergenerational toxic family dynamics. It does this while becoming the best realization of the series' combat systems to date. I don't believe in perfect pieces of art, or perfection in general, but if there ever was a game that made an argument in favor of those concepts, it's DMC 5. This game is so good that if DMC 6 came out and was essentially a level pack using the exact same combat systems, I wouldn't even be mad. Once you play 5, it's genuinely hard to go back to the older games, because it just feels that good. It's a genuine labor of love, and that love is infectious. This might be the most fun that I've had with one of my projects for this channel. If it's not clear already, I love DMC, and I've wound up taking far longer on this project than I expected. In a sense, this project has been the background radiation of the entire first year of my master's degree. I began writing in October and finished writing in April. Over that time, though, I've played countless hours of every game in the DMC series. Well, maybe not countless for 2, but whatever. This is my longest script by far, and part of that is because I had more games to talk about, but the other part is absolutely just my pure love for DMC as a series. I came into this series a newcomer to character action games, and left a fully converted lover of the genre. Sure, I might not be the best, but being the best was never the point. Looking and feeling cool is. It says something about the quality of the series that I've logged multiple playthroughs of every title, and still feel like I could go back to more. It says even more that once I was done with my research playthroughs for the video, a lot of the free time during which I should have been writing this script was spent playing Bloody Palace or going back to S-rank missions. DMC, while violent and dealing with demons, is more about joy than anything else. It's a celebration of the design principles that drove an earlier and forgotten age of game development. This series, though, is one of the few that I've seen manage to take that heritage, iterate upon it, and modernize it, without losing any of what made it special in the first place. DMC started out as the fastest-paced, most satisfying single-player action game on the market, and despite some bumps in the road, it remains that way to this day. It's simultaneously simple and deep, brutal and joyous, silly and serious, all in equal measure, and without ever leaning so far in either direction that one or the other falls flat. It's sometimes difficult to talk about DMC because a lot of the best things about it are in the feeling you get from playing it. The gameplay is feverishly addictive in a way that I've never really felt from any other game, and there's only so many times that I can just say that it feels so right. The best thing about this channel is when I move back through a series and find out not just that it's as good as people say it is, but also it's become one of my new favorites. I'm now a passionate fan of DMC in a way that I never would have expected to be simply because I decided to take up this project. Now I just have to hope that I didn't come in at the end. We still don't know if or when there'll be a DMC 6, but rest assured that once there is, I'll be more than motivated to play it. Thanks for listening, and hopefully I'll come back again sooner next time.